The map was wrong. Henrietta Whitaker knew it the moment David Watkins unfolded it at the supper table that first evening, smoothing the yellowed paper with the flat of his palm, as though the gesture alone could iron out the falsehoods printed upon it. She had seen that map before. She had grown up reading the land that map described, had walked every dry creek bed and limestone ridge the cartographer had gotten wrong, and she understood immediately, with the quiet certainty of someone who has lived inside a truth too long to doubt it, that the man sitting across from her did not know where he was. He thought he was 12 miles east of the Cimarron. He was closer to 30. He thought the water source marked with a small blue circle was a reliable spring. It had been dry since 1871, 3 years before this evening in the autumn of 1874. He thought the canyon marked as passable in summer was a seasonal wash that flooded without warning. She had lost a mule to that canyon when she was 14 years old. But David Watkins sat there with his broad shoulders squared and his jaw set at the precise angle of a man who has decided, with great finality, that he is not lost, and Henrietta looked at the map and looked at his face and made a decision of her own. She said nothing. She poured him more coffee from the blackened pot, and she said nothing at all. That was the beginning of it. That was the secret she had carried for 8 months now, and it had grown from a small, practical silence into something enormous and terrifying, and entirely outside her control. Because somewhere in those 8 months of watching, David Watkins learned the land he was too proud to admit he didn't know. Henrietta Whitaker had fallen desperately, irreversibly in love with the man. And now he was standing in the yard in the last red light of an October evening, with his hat crushed between his hands and his face doing something she had never seen it do before. And he was saying words she had never expected to hear from a man of his particular variety of pride. He was saying, you knew from the first day, and you never said a word. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded over her chest and the wind pulling at the loose braid over her shoulder, and she met his eyes across the 20 feet of dusty yard between them, and she did not deny it. Yes, she said, I knew. The silence that followed was the longest of her 31 years on Earth. It was wider than the Cimarron, deeper than the canyon that had swallowed her mule, and hotter than any summer noon on the Oklahoma Territory plains. David Watkins stared at her with his gray eyes and his crushed hat, and his 8 months of pride laid bare between them like the map he had never admitted was wrong, and Henrietta Whitaker waited, because waiting was something she had always been very good at. She had been waiting since the first day. She supposed she could wait a little longer. But the way his face crumbled at the edges, the way the line of his jaw trembled just once before he locked it down again, told her that this moment was not about the map at all anymore. This moment was about everything the map had come to mean between them, and it was time, finally, to stop waiting. She unfolded her arms and stepped off the porch. To understand how they arrived at that October doorway, you have to go back to March, to the particular cold morning that David Watkins first rode up the track to Henrietta Whitaker's homestead, with that wrong map folded in his breast pocket, and a proposition from her late father's land attorney tucked into the saddlebag beside it. The Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1874 was a place of spectacular contradiction. The grass was coming back green and stubborn from a dry winter, pushing up through the red cracked soil with the sort of determination that the land itself seemed to specialize in. The sky above the treeless plains was the particular shade of blue that exists only at altitude and only in the early morning, before the heat had a chance to bleach it pale. And Henrietta Whitaker was standing on the roof of her barn with a hammer and a mouthful of nails when the stranger's horse appeared at the bottom of the track. She watched him come without stopping her work. She had learned that particular stillness from her father, the habit of observing without being observed, of knowing before the knowing was confirmed. The rider sat a good horse, a bay with clean legs and an easy way of moving that suggested regular grain and good care. The man himself sat straight but not stiff, the way someone sits when they have spent enough years in a saddle that the posture has become simply how they exist in the world rather than something they have to think about. He was not from here. She could tell that from the roof of her barn. Something in the angle of his hat, the cut of his coat, the way his eyes swept the flat horizon with just a half-second too much calculation, the look of a man doing arithmetic instead of simply seeing. Men who had grown up on the plains saw the plains the way they saw their own hands. Men who came from somewhere else saw them the way they looked at a map. She climbed down from the roof when he was close enough that it would have been rude not to. He pulled up at the fence and touched his hat brim, and she saw his face for the first time. He was perhaps 33 or 34, she estimated, with gray eyes set under dark brows and a face that had been weathered just enough to look honest. There was a scar along his jaw, old and faded, the kind that no longer has a story attached to it, just evidence. His expression had the quality she had already named in her mind, that specific configuration of features that said this man believes himself to be exactly where he intends to be. "Miss Whitaker," he said. His voice was deeper than she'd expected and carried a faint trace of something southern, Georgia perhaps, or the Carolinas, worn smooth by years of living somewhere that wasn't. "That's right," she said. "David Watkins," he said. "I've got correspondence from Abner Fisk's office in Caldwell. I understand he handled your father's affairs." Abner Fisk. Her father's attorney, yes, and a man who had been managing the complicated business of what Elias Whitaker had left behind with the sort of officious competence that she both appreciated and found mildly irritating. She had known something was coming from Fisk's office. She had not known it would arrive on a bay horse with gray eyes and a wrong map. "Come in," she said, and opened the gate. She had not offered that invitation lightly. The homestead that Elias Whitaker had built and his daughter had fought to maintain was not a place that received visitors easily. It sat 12 miles from the nearest town, which was a collection of buildings called Morrow's Creek that possessed a general store, a livery, a saloon of questionable reputation, and a post office that doubled as the sheriff's headquarters. Henrietta had neighbors, but they were the plains kind of neighbors, visible only as a thin line of smoke on the horizon rather than someone you might speak to on a regular basis. She had lived alone here for 2 years, since Elias died in the winter of 1872. Before that, she had lived here with Elias since her mother passed in 1864, when Henrietta was 21 and the war was swallowing the East whole. The homestead was hers by inheritance. 960 acres of Oklahoma Territory grassland, with the water rights to a dependable spring, and the grazing rights to 2 sections of government land that her father had secured through a combination of persistence and political connection that Henrietta had always secretly admired. She had 12 cattle, a good well, 40 acres of winter wheat that was showing its spring face, and a mule named Consequence who had replaced the original mule the canyon had taken. She had a vegetable garden, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a reputation in Morrow's Creek as a woman who managed her own affairs with considerable competence. She did not need a great deal. She did not need a man. She made coffee and sat across from David Watkins at her kitchen table and read the letter from Fisk's office while he waited with the patience of someone accustomed to being waited upon without being servile about it. The letter was more complicated than she had anticipated. Her father had apparently entered into a land agreement in the last year of his life, a partnership arrangement with a ranching concern out of Wichita, and the terms of that agreement had provisions that transferred to his heir upon his death. In plain language, what it meant was that David Watkins, who represented that ranching concern, had a legal interest in her grazing rights on the government land sections, and the terms of the agreement allowed him to exercise that interest by operating a small cattle operation from her land for a period not to exceed 3 years, in exchange for which she would receive a percentage of whatever profits the operation generated. She set the letter down and looked at David Watkins across her kitchen table, and she thought several things simultaneously. She thought that Abner Fisk might have mentioned this before today. She thought that her father, who she loved fiercely and missed terribly, had nevertheless occasionally made decisions without consulting her that she then had to live with, and that this appeared to be one of those decisions. She thought that David Watkins was watching her read his face the way she had read the horizon, with the competence of long practice, and he was not entirely comfortable with the fact that she appeared to be managing it. She thought that the map folded in his breast pocket, which she could see the edge of, was the Hendricks survey map, which she recognized from its distinctive blue-bordered corner, and she thought that if he was relying on the Hendricks survey for anything other than a general sense of which way was north, he was going to have some interesting problems in the months ahead. "How many head are you planning to run?" she asked. "I'm starting with 40, he said, "building toward 120 by autumn." She did the arithmetic silently. That was manageable on the grazing sections. He was not asking for anything unreasonable. The agreement was real and legally binding, and her father had signed it, and she did not have the funds to contest it in court even if she had wanted to, which she found, somewhat to her own surprise, she did not particularly want to do. "There's a bunkhouse," she said, "west of the barn. It needs work, but the structure is sound. You're welcome to use it." He thanked her. He was polite about it, not effusively so, just the clean politeness of someone who understands that politeness is a form of respect rather than a performance. She appreciated that. She did not tell him about the map. She told herself it was because she was not certain yet how wrong it was. She told herself she needed to confirm her suspicions before she said anything. She told herself that a man who had arrived with legal papers and a proper arrangement did not need the woman of the house second-guessing his navigation on day one. She told herself these things, and she almost believed them. What she did not admit, not then, was that some small and unfamiliar part of her wanted to watch. Wanted to see how he would handle the land, whether he would feel it out or fight it, whether the discrepancy between what he believed and what was true would make him reckless or careful. She had lived alone for 2 years, and before that with a father who was brilliant but not communicative, and she was lonely in a way she had not yet allowed herself to name, and watching David Watkins navigate her world was, at minimum, something interesting to do. He moved into the bunkhouse 3 days later with a second horse, a pack mule, his tools, his bedroll, and his wrong map. She observed over the following weeks that he was not a foolish man. He was careful and methodical in the way that people who have learned to be careful through expensive mistakes tend to be. He checked fence lines before he trusted them. He tested the well water before he let his horses drink deeply. He watched the sky with a seriousness that told her he had been caught by weather before and did not intend to be caught again. He was also, she noted, absolutely constitutionally incapable of asking for directions. The first time she noticed it clearly was in the 3rd week of March, when she watched him ride out toward the eastern section with his map, and come back 3 hours later from the wrong direction, his horse darkened with sweat that spoke of a longer ride than the terrain called for. He said nothing. He brushed down his horse with the focused silence of a man compartmentalizing. She said nothing either. The second time was in early April, when she overheard him in Morrow's Creek telling Tom Garnett at the general store about the good water source he had found on the eastern section, and she recognized from his description that he was talking about a seasonal pool left by spring runoff that would be dry by June, not the blue circle spring on his map that he believed he had located. She bought her flour and her salt, and she did not correct him in front of Tom Garnett. The third time, and the time that shifted something fundamental inside her, was a rainy evening in late April when she found him at the kitchen table with the Hendricks map spread out under the lamp, frowning at it with his pencil making small notes in the margin. And she understood from the location of those notes that he had mapped himself approximately 8 miles west of where he actually was. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a full minute, watching him work, and she felt the enormous, complicated tug of a decision that had already been made without her conscious participation. She had not told him because she was watching him. She had not told him because she was interested in how he thought. She had not told him, and this was the truth she was only beginning to face because she liked him, and telling him would mean forcing him to admit something he was not ready to admit. And the pride on his face when he looked at that map was the same pride she saw when he rode his fence lines, and when he handled his cattle, and when he shook hands with Tom Garnett, and she did not want to be the person who took that from him, not yet, not until she had to. April became May. May became June. The Oklahoma Territory summer arrived with its particular brand of unrelenting commitment, the heat pressing down on the grassland like a physical weight, the sky going white at noon, the cattle moving slowly toward whatever shade the terrain grudgingly offered. David Watkins adapted to it without complaint, which she respected enormously, because she had seen men from elsewhere fold under an Oklahoma summer like paper in rain. He was up before dawn every morning, she knew, because she was up before dawn herself, and she heard him moving in the bunkhouse before the first gray light showed in the east. He worked the land with a thoroughness that was beginning, day by day, to tell her that he was not just working his legal agreement. He was beginning to love the place. She watched him learn. She watched him figure out that the dry creek bed was not dry in the way it appeared on the map, that it had shallow, subsurface water that the cottonwoods to the north were telling you about if you knew to read them. She never told him about the cottonwoods. But she watched the morning he figured it out himself, standing at the edge of that creek bed with his hat pushed back and his hands on his hips, and then slowly looking north at the trees. And she felt something rise in her chest that was warm and painful in equal measure. He brought a small wooden table out of the bunkhouse one evening in early June and put it under the big oak east of the barn, and that became where he ate his supper when the evenings were good. She had noticed that he was a reasonably adequate cook, which had surprised her. She made a point of not noticing what he ate, but the smells that came from the bunkhouse stovepipe were occasionally suggestive of a man who had spent time in kitchens. She started leaving things. It was not a conscious decision, or at least she did not examine it as one. She left a jar of her apple preserves on the bunkhouse step one morning with no explanation, and he left the jar back on her porch the next day, empty, with his hat placed over it in a gesture she understood as a thank you of the nonverbal variety. She left bread. He left the hat. She left salt-cured ham she had done herself. He left back a set of fence posts cut from the elm deadfall at the south end of the property, which she had mentioned needing a month prior. They were conducting a conversation with objects, and both of them understood this, and neither of them mentioned it. The first time they had a real conversation was July 4th, which was a significant date for the territory, and was marked in Morrow's Creek with a modest celebration that involved the firing of several revolvers at approximately 11 in the evening, and a great deal of Tom Garnett's not-quite-legal spirits. Henrietta had gone into town for the day to collect her monthly post and the particular writing paper she ordered from the Caldwell Supply, and David Watkins had gone in for grain, and they arrived back at the homestead at the same time, their horses matching pace on the last half-mile of the track in the blue dusk, and something about the particular quality of that evening, the sky still holding the last bruised orange of the sunset and the frogs starting up in the marsh to the north, made conversation feel natural rather than effortful. "Your father built this place from nothing," he said. It was not a question. He had been asking about Elias Whitaker in Morrow's Creek, she knew, because Tom Garnett had mentioned it with the cheerful indiscretion that characterized most of his social interactions. "He came out in '58, she said, with $3 and a wagon. My mother came 6 months later when he'd got the well dug and the first structure up. She said she wouldn't follow a man to nowhere until he had at least made it somewhere." David Watkins made a sound that might have been a laugh, short and genuine. "Sensible woman. She was," Henrietta said. "She didn't live long enough on this land to be recognized for it, but she was." He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not fill the quiet with condolence. Men who didn't know what to say with grief often said too much. He let the silence be what it was. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Originally." "Virginia," he said after a pause that was a half-second too long, the pause of someone choosing how much truth to commit to. "Before the war. After the war, from wherever there was work." She did not press. She had heard that particular formulation before, from men who had come through the war on one side or the other, and found that the world they returned to was not the world they had left, and that moving west was the only grammar available for the sentence their lives had become. It was not a story unique to David Watkins, but the specific weight he gave the pause told her it was not a light story either. "What brought you to this operation?" she asked. "The Wichita Concern." "I know cattle," he said. "And I know how to make something from land. It's what I'm good at." It was not a complete answer. She filed it in the place she was building, mentally, for the things he did not say. They unsaddled their horses side by side in the barn, working in the comfortable parallel of people who know their way around a horse, and the lantern light made the dusty air gold. And Henrietta Whitaker was extremely careful not to look at David Watkins more than was necessary, because she already knew that she was in significant trouble where this man was concerned, and she was not yet prepared to do anything about it. Summer deepened. The wheat came in, and she brought in a hand from Morrow's Creek, a young man named Pierce Oakes who was 19 and eager and not particularly skilled, but made up for it in sheer willingness. And David Watkins helped with the harvest without being asked, working the rows from first light. And that was the week Henrietta stopped being able to tell herself that what she felt was merely interest. You cannot watch a man work a harvest from your father's fields with the kind of care that suggests he is not working someone else's land but his own, without feeling something that has nothing to do with intellectual curiosity. She was in love with him. She accepted this as a fact on a Tuesday afternoon in late August when she was standing at the well, and he walked past with his shirt sleeves rolled and his hat in his hand, wiping the heat from his forehead with his forearm, and he glanced over at her and said, "Good yield on the North 40. And she said, "Better than last year." And they shared a look of mutual satisfaction over the wheat that had absolutely nothing to do with the wheat. She was in love with him, and he did not know where he was, and she had known from the first day. The question she asked herself in August was whether those two facts were going to remain separate. She was still asking it in September when the first real crisis came. He had taken his cattle out to the eastern grazing section in late August, and by September the water situation was beginning to develop in the direction she had known it would develop since March. The seasonal pools were gone. The map's blue circle spring was not there, because it had never been there, not in any reliable sense, not since 1871. He was ranging the cattle farther each day looking for water, and she could track his movements from the homestead by the way the dust rose on the horizon and the direction it traveled. He had not said anything. He would not say anything. The pride on his face at supper, which they had begun sharing on the porch 3 evenings a week in an arrangement that neither of them had formally proposed, was of the armored variety now, the kind of pride that has something specific to protect. She made her decision on a Wednesday morning in the second week of September. She saddled her mare and she rode out east. She found him at the edge of the dry creek bed, exactly where she had expected to find him, studying his map with the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the map and the world are not having the same conversation. His cattle were scattered across the brown grass behind him, lowing with the particular discontent of thirsty animals. The sky overhead was a white and merciless blue. He heard her coming and looked up, and she saw the flash of something across his face before he controlled it. Not anger, something more complicated. The expression of a man who has been found in the one place he did not want to be found. She dismounted without ceremony and walked to where he stood and held out her hand. He looked at her hand for a moment. "The map," she said. He gave it to her. The act of giving it to her cost him something. She could see that. She did not make it smaller by pretending she couldn't. She spread the map on the saddle of her mare and pointed without speaking, tracing the line of the mismarked terrain. She pointed to the blue circle that was not a spring. She pointed to the creek that was not where the map placed it. She pointed to the actual location 8 miles north of the water source his cattle needed. He was very quiet while she did this. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since the first day," she said. "Since you spread this map on my table." The silence was total. Even the cattle seemed to feel it because they stopped lowing. The wind moved across the brown grass and made its own sound, and that was all. "And you said nothing," he said. "No," she said. She looked up at him then, because she felt she owed him that directness. His face had done the complicated thing she had been watching it do for months, working through several responses before settling on the one he would actually allow, and the one he settled on was not anger. She had expected anger. What she saw instead was something rawer than anger, a kind of stripped exposure that she understood immediately was rarer and more significant than any emotion he had shown her yet. "Why?" he said. She folded the map along its original lines, taking her time with it. "Ride north with me," she said. "I'll show you where the water is. Then we can talk about the why." He mounted without another word. They rode north together through the September heat, her mare and his bay moving well together the way horses do when they've shared the same stable for months. And the land opened up around them in the particular way the eastern Oklahoma Territory has of seeming featureless until you know it, and then resolving into 1,000 specific, known places. She rode from memory and from childhood, and from 2 years of solitary management of everything her father had built, and she brought him to the water in the time she had estimated, 40 minutes at an easy pace, the good spring that lay at the base of a limestone shelf where the map had not thought to look. He sat on his horse at the edge of that spring for a long moment. His cattle were a long push away, but she knew he was noting the terrain, marking it in the way he would mark it on the correct map, the one he would make from this day forward from what was actually there rather than what the Hendricks survey believed was there. "We need to get the cattle up here," he said. "I know," she said. They spent the afternoon moving the herd. It was hot and slow, and exactly the kind of work that does not allow for pretense, because it requires communication and coordination, and the temporary setting aside of everything that is not the cattle and the water and the distance between them. They worked well together. She had expected that because they had always worked well together from the harvest on, when it had stopped being 2 separate operations and become, in practice, one. When the cattle were settled and the horses were watered and the sun was beginning its slow fall toward the western horizon, they sat on the limestone shelf above the spring, and David Watkins said, "Tell me the why." She looked out at the grass, which was losing its summer brown to the first hint of autumn gold, and she thought about how to say the thing that was true without saying more than she was ready to say. "I watched you figure things out," she said. "You're good at it. Better than most men I've seen work this land. I didn't want to take that from you." He was quiet for a moment. "That's part of it," he said. She looked at him then. He was looking at the horizon, his profile against the evening sky, and the expression on his face was thoughtful rather than confrontational. "Yes," she said, "that's part of it." He turned his head and looked at her, and the gray of his eyes in the September evening light was the color of the sky just before rain. "What's the rest of it?" Henrietta Whitaker had been 31 years on Earth without telling a man that she was in love with him. She had had admirers, men from Morrow's Creek and from Caldwell, and once from a ranch operation south of the Cimarron, and she had handled each of them with the calm efficiency with which she handled most things. She had never felt the thing she was feeling now, which was the combined terror and necessity of a truth that had gotten too large to contain. "I think you know the rest of it," she said. He looked at her for a long time. The evening wind moved between them, warm and dry and carrying the smell of the grass and the limestone and the water below. "I have not always been good at knowing things that are right in front of me," he said, "as has been established." She laughed. It came out unexpectedly, the kind of laugh that surprises the person laughing, genuine and unguarded. And she saw something shift in his face when he heard it, a softening along the jaw, a warmth in the gray eyes, and he smiled at her just briefly, just at the edges, and that small smile undid more of her careful construction than everything that had preceded it. "I should have told you," she said. "About the map." "No," he said. "You were right. The way you did it was right." He paused. "I am not good at being lost. I should be better at it. It is not a moral failing to be lost." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." "My father," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "I grew up in a house where admitting you didn't know something was the same as admitting weakness. It takes a long time to unlearn that." This was the most he had offered her of himself in 6 months of daily proximity, and she received it with the care it deserved. "How long were you lost before today?" she asked. "In some ways," he said, "for about 34 years. He paused. "In terms of the specific geographic situation, since April." "April," she said. "I've been covering about 5 extra miles a day," he said, with the very small, rueful expression of a man making a confession that costs him something. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You've been watching me ride in the wrong direction for 5 months." "East," she said. "You kept going east." Something crossed his face that was not quite amusement and not quite pain, and was a combination of the two that she thought she would be able to identify on his face for the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. "East," he repeated. They rode back to the homestead in the dark, their horses knowing the way. The stars came out over the Oklahoma territory in their extravagant numbers, the way they do when you are far enough from any town that the night is genuinely dark, and the sound of their horses on the dry ground was the only human sound in all that enormous darkness. He helped her with her mare without being asked, and she did not tell him not to. And when they had finished in the barn and were standing in the yard with the stars overhead and the lamp burning in the bunkhouse window, he said, "Henrietta." It was the first time he had used her name. He had been calling her Miss Whitaker for 6 months. "David," she said, also the first time. He took 3 steps toward her across the dusty yard and stopped, and she thought for one terrible moment that he was going to retreat into the formal distance they had been maintaining, that the pride was going to reassemble itself and stand between them again like a fence, and she took her own 3 steps to close the distance herself. He looked at her face in the lamplight from the bunkhouse window, and she let him look. "I would like very much to court you properly," he said. "If that is something you would consider." Henrietta Whitaker, who had managed 960 acres alone for 2 years and had faced down 2 hard winters and a drought and a dispute with the county surveyor, and the grief of losing both her parents and the particular loneliness of being competent and alone, felt something unlock in her chest that she had not realized was locked. "I would consider it," she said. He smiled. It was not the brief edge smile from the limestone shelf. It was a full smile, and it transformed his face in a way that made her understand why she had been cataloging the smaller versions of it for months. She had been waiting for the real one without knowing she was waiting. He walked her to her porch. He did not touch her. That was the right choice, and she noted it. "Good night, Henrietta," he said at the porch step. "Good night, David," she said. She went inside and stood with her back against the door in the dark kitchen and breathed. Courting in the Oklahoma territory in 1874 was not a complicated procedure in its social infrastructure, because there was not very much social infrastructure to navigate. There was no ballroom, no calling card ritual, no elaborate season. What there was the land and the work and the occasional Sunday in Morrow's Creek, and the slow accumulation of shared time and shared labor that was, in the end, the only honest currency of the frontier. What David Watkins did, in the weeks that followed the September afternoon at the spring, was show up. He showed up at the kitchen door on Sunday mornings with firewood already split, not because she couldn't split her own firewood, but because it was something he could give her, and she accepted it as such. He showed up at the fence line she was mending on the south quarter one afternoon, and worked beside her without being asked, and they argued cheerfully about the correct tension for barbed wire. which was a recent innovation she was cautiously in favor of and he was more cautious about. And the argument went on pleasantly for 3 days and resolved in her favor when the cattle tested the fence and the barbed wire held. He showed up on the porch in the evenings with 2 cups of coffee and the quiet that she had always preferred to noise, and they sat and watched the plains darken under the October stars and talked about the things that matter. The land, the winter coming, the letter she had from her cousin in Missouri, the problem with the roof on the north side of the barn, the war, which they had both survived in different ways and different places, and which sat between them not as a wound, but as a shared history neither of them had chosen. He told her about Virginia. He did it in pieces over several evenings, the way you tell things that are difficult by not trying to tell them all at once. The plantation his father had owned, which was a word he used carefully, because the thing the word referred to was a thing he had been examining the ethics of since he was old enough to understand what it meant. He had been 15 when the war started. His 2 brothers had gone to fight for the Confederacy, and he had spent 2 years being told he was going to go with them, and 2 years refusing, in the particular quiet, determined way that it became clear he had been doing things since he was old enough to know his own mind. He had not fought for the Union either. He had gone west in 1863, not running from anything he would precisely name, but moving toward the space that the frontier represented, the place where what your father owned and who your grandfather had been counted for somewhat less than what you could do with your own hands. He had done many things with his own hands. He had hired himself out as a drover, worked ranches in Kansas and Colorado, learned cattle and land and weather, and the particular arithmetic of frontier economics. He had sent money back to Virginia after the war, to what remained of the family, not as penance but as responsibility. He had not gone back himself. She told him about her father. The man Elias Whitaker had been, brilliant and stubborn and occasionally oblivious, in ways that she found easier to love now that he was gone than she had always found it in his presence. The way he had taught her the land, not as a formal education, but as the natural byproduct of going everywhere with him from the time she could walk, because there was no one else to leave her with, and the land was where he was. The way she had learned to read weather and water and grass and livestock, not from a book, but from 12,000 mornings of watching a man who knew all of it the way he knew his own body. She told him about her mother, which was harder. Clara Whitaker, who had come from Philadelphia with a small trunk of books and the absolute conviction that intelligence was more useful than any tool, and who had taught Henrietta mathematics and literature, and the particular kind of thinking that asks why before it accepts what. Clara, who had loved the territory fiercely and died of a fever in the winter of 1864, 3 years after Henrietta's only brother had died of the same fever in the same hard winter. The family had reduced itself, through disease and distance and the war's indifference, to Elias and Henrietta, and then to Henrietta alone. "You've been holding this whole place by yourself," David said one October evening. He said it not with pity but with the recognition that is better than pity. "I have," she said. "It's an extraordinary thing," he said. She looked at him. "Most of what people do alone is extraordinary," she said. "It's only ordinary when someone helps." He was very quiet for a moment after that. The wind moved across the dark plains and the lamp between them guttered and held. "I've been going east," he said, "for 34 years, in every sense of the word." She understood what he meant. She had known what he meant from the limestone shelf. "There's good country west," she said, "if you know how to read it." He reached across the small table between them and covered her hand with his. His hand was large and warm and bore the evidence of the work he had done on her land for 7 months, the calluses and the small scars, and the particular roughness that was not roughness but history. She turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight while the territory dark pressed soft and enormous against the porch. And it was the most intimate thing she had ever experienced, which told her something about what she had been missing. October became the setting for What Morrow's Creek, with the avidity of a community that had very little to discuss beyond weather and livestock, chose to notice and comment upon. Tom Garnett said nothing directly to either of them, but managed to make the purchase of supplies a 10-minute social occasion on both their parts. Mrs. Cooney at the post office was less subtle, asking Henrietta twice in 1 month whether she was expecting a visitor for the winter, with the particular emphasis on visitor that meant something specific. Henrietta answered that she was not expecting a visitor, but that the winter was looking manageable, which was not precisely the question Mrs. Cooney had asked, and both of them knew it. There was a church in Morrow's Creek, a small building of unpainted timber that served Baptist services on alternate Sundays when the circuit preacher came through. Henrietta attended when she felt the distance was worth the ride, which was perhaps 1 Sunday in 3. She had attended on the 2nd Sunday of October, and had been startled to find David Watkins already seated when she arrived, which meant he had ridden 12 miles on a Sunday morning to a church he had never attended before for reasons that were obvious to everyone in the building within 30 seconds of Henrietta, sitting 2 rows in front of him. Tom Garnett had caught her eye during the hymn with an expression of profound satisfaction. David had walked her home. 12 miles was a long walk, and they covered it on horseback at a comfortable pace, talking the whole way about the sermon, which had been on the subject of humility, and which had made David look at the middle distance with an expression she'd had to work not to smile at, about the winter coming, about the cattle, which were in good condition and well watered now that the spring situation was resolved, about a book she was reading, Middlemark, which had arrived from Caldwell in a package her cousin had sent, and which she was discovering she had complicated feelings about. "What kind of complicated feelings?" he asked. "The heroine is very intelligent," Henrietta said, "and she keeps making choices that limit her own freedom because she doesn't trust herself to deserve better." A pause. "Do you feel that way?" "No," she said, "but I understand the feeling, and I think George Eliot understood it from the inside." "The author is a woman," he said. "The author is a woman using a man's name," she said, "which is its own kind of limited freedom." He thought about this for a long stretch of their ride. She let him think. "The world asks women to earn the right to be themselves," he said finally, "and then tells them they've asked for too much." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He was looking straight ahead down the track, but something in the line of his jaw had gone earnest in a way that was new. "I don't want to be that," he said. "A limitation." She understood that this was the most direct thing he had said to her about what he wanted from this, whatever this was. She did not let the moment be wasted. "You're not," she said. "You're the opposite of that." He looked at her then, and there was the full smile again, the one that unlocked her, and they rode the rest of the way home in the particular warm silence that is only available between people who have said something real and do not need to add to it. It was in late October that the business of the legal arrangement clarified itself in a way that changed the stakes of everything. She received a letter from Abner Fisk. The letter informed her that the Wichita ranching concern that David Watkins represented had been dissolved due to the financial difficulties of the primary investors, which was a consequence of the broader economic disruptions following the Panic of 1873 that were still working their way through the Western Territories 18 months later. The dissolution of the concern altered the terms of the land agreement, and specifically it meant that the provision allowing David Watkins to operate his cattle operation from her property was no longer enforceable as originally written. In practical terms, the letter told her, his legal basis for being on her land had ended. She sat with the letter for a long time at the kitchen table. She thought about what it meant, stripped of the legal language. It meant that the reason David Watkins had first appeared at the bottom of her track, the legal arrangement her father had signed, was gone. It meant that his presence on her land was now a matter of choice rather than contract. It meant she would have to tell him. It also meant that for the past 7 months, and most particularly for the past 6 weeks of courtship conducted with the steady honesty of two people who had decided to be real with each other. Neither of them had mentioned the thing she had always been thinking about. What happened at the end of 3 years? What happened when his agreement concluded, and he was free to go wherever the next cattle operation took him? She had not let herself think past the current arrangement, because the current arrangement had a built-in limit, and she had found it easier not to look at that limit directly. Now the limit was here, 5 months early, and she needed to tell him. She found him at the bunkhouse after supper that evening, sitting outside with a cup of coffee in the last of the daylight, reading a week-old copy of the Caldwell commercial that Tom Garnett had passed along. He looked up when he heard her coming, and the expression on his face when he saw hers told her that he could already read her the way she had been reading him. "What's happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it twice. She watched him read it and watched him understand it, and then watched him look up at her with the expression that she had learned, by now, to read with considerable precision. It was the expression he wore when he was deciding how much truth to commit to. "Fisk should have sent this to me as well," he said. "I'll contact him directly, but this letter is accurate. I received word from the Wichita principals 3 weeks ago." She stared at him. 3 weeks ago. "Yes. You've known for 3 weeks." He set the letter down on his knee. "Yes," he said, "I've known." She had spent 7 months watching him navigate a wrong map rather than admit he was lost, and she had thought she understood all the shapes his pride could take. She had thought the limestone shelf had shown her the deepest one. She discovered now that she had not been entirely right. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. He was very still for a moment. "Because I was trying to work out what I was going to say when I told you," he said, "and I needed the answer to be right before I said it." "What answer?" she said. He stood up. He set his coffee cup down, and he folded the letter, and he held it back out to her, and she took it, and then he did not step back. He was standing closer to her than he had ever stood, and in the last light of the October evening she could see the particular look on his face that she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it, the look that has no pride in it at all, that is nothing but the truth. "I want to stay," he said. "Not on the terms of an agreement that no longer exists. I want to stay because this is where I want to be. Because you are where I want to be." He paused. "I'm asking you to marry me, Henrietta. I'm asking it plainly because I am done with indirection where you are concerned. You are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I love you, and I want to build something here with you that is not bound by the terms of any legal arrangement. That is just ours together, for as long as you'll have me." The wind moved across the yard. The lamp in the bunkhouse window was burning. The stars were beginning to show. She had been waiting since the first day. She had known from the first evening at this table, from the wrong map and the right posture and the gray eyes that were already trying to read everything they could see, that something significant had arrived in the form of this man, and she had waited to see what it would become, and she had watched it become everything she had hoped for and more than she had thought to hope for. "Yes," she said. His whole face changed. It was remarkable to watch. The pride that had been the first thing she had seen on that face, and the last armor it had taken off, fell entirely away. And what was underneath it was simple and open, and more handsome than the pride had ever been. He took her face in his hands and kissed her, right there in the yard in the lamplight, with the stars coming out over the Oklahoma territory. And it was the first kiss, and it was, she thought, precisely correct, warm and real, and without any of the performance that she had always distrusted in men who made things more complicated than they needed to be. "I've been lost," he said against her forehead after. "Since long before I came here. You should know that." "I know," she said. "I've known from the first day." "I know you have," he said. "That's the other thing I love about you." They married in December of 1874, in the small timber church in Morrow's Creek on a Sunday when the circuit preacher was present, and the sky was the pewter gray of an Oklahoma winter holding off its snow. It was not an elaborate wedding. Henrietta wore the good dress she had been keeping since her mother's time, a dark blue wool that she had let out at the waist and pressed with the flat iron the night before, and she braided her hair and pinned it up with the 2 bone pins that had been her mother's. David wore his good coat and the hat he had been wearing when he rode up the track in March, which she had mentioned once was a good hat, and he had not forgotten. Tom Garnett was there, and Mrs. Cooney, and Pierce Oakes, who had stayed on as a hired hand through the autumn, and a handful of others from the surrounding homesteads who had, through the frontier telegraph of rumor and neighborly awareness, found out that the Whitaker woman was marrying and considered it worth a winter ride to witness. The preacher said the words. She said yes, and meant it in every layer of herself that was capable of meaning. He said yes, and his voice did not waver, which she noted, because his voice was always steady, but this was a different kind of steady. They rode home together in the afternoon, through the pewter light and the wind that was beginning to smell of the snow that was coming, and the homestead was there at the end of the track the way it always was, the barn and the bunkhouse and the house that Elias Whitaker had built from nothing, and it was hers, and now it was theirs. He did not move into the house immediately. He moved his things from the bunkhouse the next morning, in the unhurried and practical way that he moved through most of the business of his life, and he found the places for his things in her house without disrupting the arrangement of hers, which she noted and appreciated. He put his books on the shelf beside hers. He put his maps, the new ones he had been drawing from memory and observation since September, in the drawer of the desk where her father's papers had lived. He put his hat on the hook by the door next to her coat, and that particular image, the hat and the coat, was the one that made it real to her in the deepest way. Winter on the territory was a different kind of test than summer. The cold came in with a serious intent, and the snow when it arrived in January of 1875 was not the picturesque variety but the working variety, deep and wind-driven, and it required the same competence and preparation from both of them that the summer heat had required. They worked together through it with the ease they had developed over the preceding months, her knowledge of the land's specific geography, and his gift for structural thinking and logistics combining into something more effective than either of them had been alone. The cattle came through the winter well. In the spring, they counted the herd, and the numbers were better than predicted, partly through good management and partly through the good fortune that the territory occasionally distributed without bias. David was quietly satisfied in the way he was about things that had gone right through work, rather than accident. He also went back to Morrow's Creek in March and corrected his land registration. He filed the correct property boundaries, using the maps he had drawn himself, and corrected several of the erroneous survey points that the Hendricks map had propagated through the official records. It was a small thing in the larger scheme, but Tom Garnett told Henrietta afterward that it had taken David Watkins the better part of 2 hours to talk the county clerk through the corrections, and he had done it with the patient thoroughness of a man who was making something right that had been wrong and did not intend to leave the job half done. She loved him more for that. She had not thought there was room for more, but there was always room for more. The spring of 1875 brought the first real expansion of the operation. David had a gift for the business side of ranching that Henrietta was happy to acknowledge, because she had always found the ledger work less interesting than the land work, and he appeared to find it genuinely engaging, sitting at the desk in the evening with the account books and the correspondence and the focused attention of a man solving a puzzle he enjoys. They discussed every significant decision together. She had not expected him to offer that, not in the way it was in 1875, when the assumption that the man's word was final in matters of property and business was so deeply embedded in the social architecture that most men exercised it without even noticing. He asked her opinion. He changed his mind when her reasoning was better. He told her once in the quiet of a spring evening that the most useful thing he had ever done was marry a woman who knew more than him, and he said it without irony. She said the most useful thing she had ever done was let a man be lost long enough to find himself, and he laughed, and it was the full laugh this time, rare and real and worth waiting for. In the summer of 1875, Henrietta discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning in July, standing in the kitchen in the early light, and she watched his face go through the entire vocabulary of human emotion in approximately 4 seconds. Shock, joy, terror, tenderness, more joy, cycling faster than she could track. He sat down at the kitchen table without saying anything for a full minute, and then he looked up at her with the expression that had no pride in it, that was simply him, and he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm very well," she said. "Good," he said. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her carefully, as though she had become something that required new calculations. She let him hold her and rested her forehead against his jaw and felt the particular gratitude of a life that has become, against all reasonable expectation, exactly what you would choose. "I'm not afraid," she said, because she could feel him being afraid on her behalf. "No," he said, "you're not afraid of anything." "That's not true," she said. "I was afraid of telling you about the map for 8 months. He laughed into her hair. "Fair point." The pregnancy was not easy in its first months, the nausea and the fatigue being particularly persistent through the Oklahoma summer heat. But she managed it with the practicality that characterized her management of everything. She did less of the heavy physical work and more of the planning and record-keeping, which suited the season's demands in any case. And David took on the physical difference without comment or martyrdom, just absorbing the additional work into his days in the way he had learned to absorb everything the land required. He was solicitous without being suffocating. He brought her things she mentioned wanting without making a ceremony of it. He sat with her in the evenings and read to her when she was tired, her own copy of Middlemarch First, which prompted a long conversation about Dorothea Brooke that went on for 3 evenings, and concluded with David's observation that Casaubon was the literary embodiment of a man who had confused his map for the territory, and Henrietta's delight at this observation was complete and genuine. He read to her from the Caldwell commercial as well, and from the letters she received from her cousin in Missouri, who was following the territory news with the particular interest of someone who had considered coming west and had decided against it, and now tracked the progress of those who had chosen differently. The cousin's name was Eliza, and her letters were detailed and entertaining, and occasionally gave Henrietta a window into a life lived more conventionally than her own, a life that she observed with affection and without envy. Their son was born in February of 1876, in the coldest month of a hard winter, which was entirely characteristic of the territory's commitment to challenging its inhabitants at every stage of life. He arrived in the early morning after a long and serious labor, attended by the midwife who came from Morrow's Creek, with Tom Garnett driving the wagon through snow that was nearly impassable, arriving with 40 minutes to spare. David waited in the kitchen because the midwife, whose name was Nell Cutter, and who had a comprehensive collection of opinions about the appropriate role of husbands during labor, was firm on this point. He waited with the patience of a man whose patience had been comprehensively tested by the previous 12 hours, and who was managing, barely, not to go mad with it. She heard him moving in the kitchen, heard the fire being stoked, heard the water heated and reheated, heard the particular quality of his footsteps that told her he was afraid and containing it. When it was over and the baby was breathing and Nell Cutter had assessed the situation and declared it satisfactory, Henrietta said to bring him in. She watched David Watkins walk into the room and see his son for the first time, and she thought afterward that this was the definitive version of the expression she had been cataloging on his face since the first evening at her table. Every smaller version had been a practice run for this one. The pride was there, but it was entirely different from the pride that had kept him from admitting he was lost. It was the pride that has nothing to protect and nothing to prove. That is simply love looking for a word for itself and finding none adequate. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the child she was holding, and his hand came up and very gently, with the precision of a man doing something he knows is beyond his skill and doing it anyway because it matters more than skill, touched the baby's face. "His name," he said. "I thought Elias," she said. "For my father." "Elias David Watkins," he said, testing it. "Yes." Little Elias was a healthy and determined infant who announced his preferences clearly and often, and who, from his earliest weeks, had his mother's eyes and his father's expression of focused concentration, which Henrietta found simultaneously funny and alarming, because she now knew what that expression looked like when it was attached to an adult who refused to admit uncertainty. "He is going to be extraordinary trouble," David said one evening in April, watching his son regard the ceiling with the absolute seriousness of a baby who has found something significant in it. "He's going to be magnificent," Henrietta said. "Both of those things," David agreed. The years that followed were good years. They were not easy years, because the territory and the decade did not specialize in easy, and the economic conditions of the 1870s and into the 1880s required constant adjustment and occasional reinvention. But they were deeply, solidly good in the way that things built on honest foundations tend to be good. David expanded the cattle operation gradually, with the methodical approach that had always characterized his best work, building toward the 120 head he had originally projected by 1877. And then, beyond that, securing additional grazing rights as they became available, and running the operation with a combination of his logistical intelligence and her intimate knowledge of the land that made them collectively more effective than either would have been separately. Pierce Oaks stayed on as a permanent hand and eventually brought a wife, a young woman from Caldwell named Marta, who became Henrietta's friend in the way that women on the plains become friends, from proximity and necessity turning into genuine affection. Henrietta continued to manage the farming side of the operation, the wheat and the vegetables and the smokehouse and the root cellar and the accounts, and she continued to learn, from books and from the land and from the accumulating years of observation, and she taught David everything she knew about reading the territory, the weather and the grass and the water and the animals, and he brought to that knowledge his own gifts for pattern and structure. And together they built something that was greater than what either of them had inherited or imagined. They fought sometimes. Real marriages with two real people in them contain disagreement, and Henrietta and David Watkins were both people of decided opinions who had spent years relying primarily on their own judgment. They argued about the barbed wire and about the cattle, and about a proposed agreement with a neighboring rancher that she thought was favorable and he thought was premature. And they argued about the political situation in the territory, which was complicated and unjust in specific ways that she had opinions about from childhood and he had opinions about from reading and observation. The arguments were clean and honest and concluded either in genuine agreement or in an acknowledged difference that did not require resolution. She discovered in their second year of marriage that he had a temper. It was not the explosive kind, which she had dealt with before in other men and found exhausting, but the compressed kind, the kind that went very quiet and very precise and could be more cutting than volume. She discovered this when he came in from a difficult day with a piece of equipment, and the combined frustration of three things going wrong in sequence expressed itself as a coldness toward her over dinner that was not about her, and that she called out directly, because she had decided early in their marriage that indirection was the one thing she would not tolerate. He apologized. He said he had done something his father used to do, which was to make the nearest person responsible for a mood that had nothing to do with them, and he did not want to do that, and he was sorry. It was the most direct apology she had ever received from anyone, and she told him so, and they had a conversation that lasted until midnight and was more important, in the long run, than the incident that had prompted it. She loved him in the ordinary daily ways that are the substance of a life together. She loved him in the early mornings when he was still half asleep, and the precise social management of his expression had not yet engaged, and he was simply himself without any armor at all. She loved him at the supper table with Elias, later with the second child, their daughter Clara, born in 1878 and named for Henrietta's mother, who had dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and her mother's gift for reading the room. She loved him in the evenings at the desk with his account books and his new maps, the correct ones he drew himself from accumulated knowledge rather than survey error. She loved him in the winter cold when the wind was hard against the windows and the fire was the center of everything, and the land outside was fierce and indifferent, and they were warm and together, and that warmth was entirely of their own making. He loved her with a completeness that she had not expected from a man who had spent so long behind the armor of his pride. The armor, once genuinely removed, left behind someone whose capacity for affection was large and uncomplicated, who was not afraid to show her that she was the center of his world because he had decided, at some point on a limestone shelf in September of 1874, that pretending otherwise was the most foolish economy he could practice. He told her he loved her in the ordinary moments as well as the significant ones. He said it when she solved a problem he had been working on by approaching it from an angle he hadn't considered. He said it when she came in from a morning ride with her hair down and her cheeks red from the wind. He said it when she said something about Middlemark that made him think about something differently, which she continued to do regularly. He said it so often and so naturally that Elias, at 3 years old, incorporated it into his own conversational vocabulary, and informed consequence the mule that he loved him, which David found funnier than Henrietta did, though she found it funnier than she let on. In the spring of 1879, Abner Fisk retired, and his successor sent them a communication regarding the land records, a routine review of property boundaries as the territory was beginning, in this period, to formalize its administrative structure in anticipation of the changes that the coming years would bring. Oklahoma Territory in 1879 was still provisional in its legal geography, a patchwork of homestead claims and government land and arrangements that had been made before the administrative apparatus was solid enough to record them comprehensively, and the successor to Fisk was engaged in the work of sorting through this. He wrote to ask whether the Watkins homestead boundary situation was as he understood it from the files, meaning whether the original Whitaker claim and the grazing rights and the partnership arrangement were all correctly reflected. David wrote back a detailed response that had taken him 2 evenings to compose, correcting several points in the records and including a copy of the maps he had drawn, which were more accurate than any of the survey documents the county had on file. He sent it with a cover note saying that if the county's surveyor wished to walk the property to verify, he was welcome at any time. The surveyor came in the summer. He was a young man of perhaps 25, fresh from a training program in Wichita, and he arrived with the confident bearing of someone who has recently acquired expertise and has not yet had it substantially tested by the world. He and David spent 3 days walking the boundary, and Henrietta watched from the activity of the homestead as the surveyor's confidence gradually adjusted downward and David's patient precision gradually registered on the younger man's assessment of the situation. On the 3rd evening, the surveyor sat at their supper table and said to Henrietta, "Your husband knows this land better than anyone I've encountered in the territory." She passed him the bread and said, "He learned it from the ground up." David caught her eye across the table, and she saw the gray-eyed expression that was just for her, the one that acknowledged the private joke they shared without needing to make it public, and she smiled into her coffee cup. After the surveyor left, with corrected records and a new appreciation for the limits of the Hendricks survey, David found her in the kitchen in the evening and leaned in the doorway the way he did when he had something to say that he was taking his time with. "I've been thinking about the eastern section," he said. "The spring," she said. "We should put up a proper structure." A stock tank fed from the spring. We could expand the grazing capacity significantly. She had been thinking the same thing for a year. I know where to source the timber, she said, and Pierce knows a man in Morrow's Creek who does the ironwork for the mechanism. He smiled. You've already planned it. I plan things, she said. You execute them. It's an arrangement that appears to be working. It's the best arrangement I've ever been party to, he said. She said, better than the original land agreement with the Wichita concern. Considerably, he said. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and turned to face him in the lamplight, and he pushed off the doorframe and came into the kitchen, and she thought about the evening she had handed him his wrong map at the limestone shelf, about the long months of silence before that, about the yard in October when he had stood with his hat in his hands and asked her to marry him, about all the miles of territory they had covered together since that first wrong map evening at the kitchen table. I have something to tell you, she said. He looked at her. He had learned to read her face as well as she had learned to read his. She watched the realization move across his eyes before she said the words. Another one, he said. Another one, she confirmed. He was across the kitchen in 2 steps and his arms around her, and she put her face against his neck, and they stayed like that in the lamplight while the territory turned on its vast dark axis outside the window, and the fire in the stove made its quiet sound, and the night was enormous, and the kitchen was small and warm and entirely sufficient. Their third child was another boy, born in the early spring of 1880, named Thomas for no one in particular, except that both of them liked the name, and he arrived with the same deliberate efficiency that characterized most of what David Watkins undertook, quickly and without unnecessary complication, which the midwife Nell Cutter said was the best review a husband's offspring could receive. Thomas was, from his earliest weeks, a sociable creature, interested in everyone and everything, constitutionally incapable of the focused internal concentration that characterized both his older siblings. He smiled at strangers and charmed the horses, and at 18 months managed to dismantle a section of the garden fence through sheer enthusiastic exploration, which Henrietta took as evidence that some things are not hereditary. He gets it from your father, David said, examining the fence. My father would have rebuilt the fence himself, she said. Give him time, David said. The spring of 1880 was also the year that a land dispute arose with a ranching concern that had moved into the territory from Texas, a large operation with significant capital, and the aggressive expansion habits that such operations tend to develop when they meet land they want. The concern was run by a man named Aldred Crane, and he had filed a claim on a portion of the government grazing sections that overlapped with the rights Elias Whitaker had secured and David had registered. It was a genuine legal conflict, with competing documentation and the kind of ambiguity that the territory's patchwork record system specialized in producing. Abner Fisk's successor wrote to them with a tone of cautious concern. Aldred Crane sent a representative to the homestead, a man named Dowell who wore a good coat and delivered threats with the smooth politeness of someone who has been trained to make the threatening sound like reason. Henrietta was very still through the conversation with Dowell. David was polite and precise and showed Dowell out at the conclusion of the meeting with the efficiency of a man who knows exactly how much of his time a conversation is worth. When Dowell was gone, David sat at the desk and looked at his maps. He thinks we'll sell, he said. He's wrong, she said. Yes, he said. He is. They went to Caldwell together, which was a 2-day trip by wagon that they had not made since before Thomas was born, leaving the children in the care of Marta Oakes and Pierce. They spent the better part of 3 days in the offices of the attorney they retained, a man named Holloway who was thorough and undramatic, going through the documentation with the systematic care that a case of this nature required. David had his maps. Henrietta had her father's original land records and the correspondence with Fisk going back to the first filing in 1858. It took 4 months and a hearing before the Territorial Land Office, but they won. The land office's decision in their favor rested substantially on the accuracy of the maps David had submitted and the thoroughness of the historical documentation, and it established a precedent regarding the original grazing rights that protected them comprehensively from future challenges of the same kind. Aldred Crane's operation, it turned out, had several other disputed claims in the territory, and the clarity of the Watkins case weakened his position in those as well, which Holloway told them about with the restrained satisfaction of a man who has done something useful. They drove home from Caldwell in the late afternoon of the day the decision was confirmed, and the light on the territory was the particular gold of early autumn, and the land spread out around them in all its enormity and specificity, every creek bed and ridge, and dry wash and living spring that they knew between them with the intimacy of people who have walked it and ridden it and built their lives upon it. "Your father's papers won that case," David said. "Your maps won that case," she said. "Our maps," he said. "I drew most of them sitting at your kitchen table with you telling me where I was wrong." She considered this. "There was one evening," she said, "when you had the north section completely backwards. I corrected it while you were getting coffee." He turned to look at her. "You corrected my map, just the north section," she said, "the spring markers." He looked at the road ahead of them. She watched him calculate, and she watched the moment he understood. "The survey submission," he said, "the maps I sent to the land office." "The north section was correct," she said, a pause, "because you fixed it." "The spring markers," she confirmed. He shook his head slowly, with the expression that contained the full archive of their shared history. The map at the kitchen table, the limestone shelf, the October yard, all of it. "You have been correcting my errors since the first day," he said. "Quietly," she said, "when they needed correcting. And waiting when they didn't," he said. "And waiting when they didn't," she agreed. He reached over on the wagon seat and took her hand the way he had taken it across the small table on that October evening when the stars were coming out, and she held his hand the way she had held it then, and they drove home through the gold afternoon with the territory opening around them, known and beloved and theirs. Elias was 7 that fall and was, as Henrietta had predicted, magnificent in ways that were sometimes indistinguishable from trouble. He had begun accompanying his father on rides around the property, sitting in front of David on the bay, who was showing his age but was still a good horse, and learning the land in the same way Henrietta had learned it, from the back of a horse with someone who knew it. She watched them from the yard sometimes, the man and the boy on the bay against the Oklahoma sky, and felt the particular fullness of a life that has become what it was always meant to be. Clara was learning to read with a focus and ambition that reminded Henrietta of her own early education, working through the books on the shelf with the absorption of a child who has discovered that reading is the most reliable form of transportation. She had strong opinions about what she read, which she expressed, and she preferred books in which women did interesting things, which Henrietta supplemented as she could through the Caldwell supply and her cousin Eliza's occasional packages. Thomas continued to be sociable and delightful and occasionally exhausting, and by age 2 had established relationships with every person and animal on the property including Consequence, who had a reputation for indifference to human company that Thomas managed to overcome through sheer persistence. In the spring of 1881, Henrietta's cousin Eliza came from Missouri for a visit, which was the first substantial company they had received at the homestead, and which required a degree of preparation that Henrietta approached with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything. Eliza was 34, unmarried, witty, and sharp, in the way that women who have spent their lives in cities often are, observant of social texture in a way that she herself was the first to acknowledge was both gift and burden. She arrived on the Caldwell stage and David drove to collect her, which Henrietta had suggested, because she thought the drive back from Caldwell would give David and Eliza time to establish a mutual understanding before Eliza's metropolitan assessments of the homestead commenced. She was right. Eliza arrived at the homestead in the evening with her trunk and her considerable collection of hat boxes and an expression of genuine delight that Henrietta had not been entirely certain she would see. "It's exactly what you described," Eliza said, looking at the house and the barn and the yard and the enormous sky. "It looks like something someone made." "It is something someone made," Henrietta said. Eliza looked at David. "Several people," she amended. "Several people," David agreed, and Eliza nodded at him with the expression of someone who has decided, on the basis of limited evidence but good instincts, to approve. Eliza stayed for 3 weeks. She was a good guest, which meant she was useful in the ways she was able to be and did not pretend to be useful in the ways she wasn't. She was devoted to Clara, whom she recognized immediately as a reader, and they spent long afternoons on the porch with books while Thomas was supervised by his father and Elias was out with the cattle. She asked Henrietta long questions about the management of the operation, genuinely interested rather than performatively curious, and she listened to the answers with the focused attention that told Henrietta these conversations were going into permanent storage. On her last evening, she and Henrietta sat on the porch after the children were in bed and David was at his desk with the accounts, and the prairie summer night moved around them with its insects and its stars, and Eliza said, "He loves you very much." "I know," Henrietta said. "It's the particular way," Eliza said, "that you can see he's worked at it. The way a man loves a woman when he has had to take down walls to do it. It shows in the structure." Henrietta thought about the walls, specifically about all the shapes of pride she had watched David Watkins remove, one season at a time, one honest conversation at a time, right down to the evening when he had stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and offered her everything he had with no map to navigate by. "He learned," she said. "We both did." "From each other," Eliza said. "Mostly," Henrietta said. "From the land." Eliza looked out at the dark prairie with the expression of someone taking a photograph she intends to keep. "I can see why you stayed," she said. "I never left," Henrietta said. "No," Eliza said, "but you could have. That's different from not being able to." This was true and important and characteristic of Eliza, who had the gift of making things precise. "There's more than love," Henrietta said after a moment. "There's all of this." She gestured at the darkness, meaning the land and the homestead and the accumulated work and the children sleeping inside. "He built this with me. Not for me. With me. That's the thing I would not have traded." Eliza left the next morning, with her trunk and her hat boxes and a packet of Henrietta's recipe for apple preserves that she had been requesting since the first jar. And they watched the wagon until it was a small moving point on the track, and then just the dust it raised, and then nothing. David stood beside her in the yard. His hand found hers. "You'll miss her," he said. "Terribly," she said, "but she'll write. Her letters are almost better than the visits." "Almost," he said. The years continued. There is a satisfaction in saying this directly, without the drama that difficulty and conflict bring to a story, because the truth of a good life is that most of it is the ordinary work of maintaining what has been built, and that work has its own texture and beauty that does not require crisis to be worth describing. David and Henrietta Watkins ran their operation through the changing landscape of the Oklahoma Territory in the 1880s, watching the administrative situation evolve as the government worked through the complicated question of what the territory would become. They watched the unassigned lands to the south begin to open up, watched the land runs begin in 1889, and bring a flood of new settlers that transformed the character of the region. They were established by then, their 960 acres a known and settled entity in the changed landscape, and David's maps, which had become locally useful documents, were referenced in several of the new surveys. Elias grew into a young man with his mother's reading of the land and his father's methodical intelligence, and both of their opinions, combined into a personality that was occasionally exhausting and always interesting. By 15, he was genuinely useful on the operation. By 17, he was indispensable. And by 19, he was running sections of it independently with a confidence that was not his father's early variety of confidence, that refused to admit error, but a confidence that had been built on the actual record of his own competence, which was a different and better thing. Clara at 15 had read everything on the shelves twice and had begun a correspondence with a teacher in Caldwell who had offered to help her pursue her education formally. A conversation that Henrietta facilitated without pressure, because the thing her mother Clara had known and had taught her daughter was that intelligence needs room to decide for itself where it wants to go. The decision Clara made was the library in Caldwell first, and then, at 18, a teaching certificate, and the teacher's life suited her with the precision of something designed for its purpose. Thomas remained into adolescence and beyond, the most sociable of the three, the one who knew everyone in Morrow's Creek by name and was known by them, who had a talent for the human side of business that his father recognized with the appreciation of someone who knows his own limits in that direction. By 20, Thomas was the face of their operation in the town and county in a way that served them all well. In 1887, David did something that Henrietta had not expected. He went back to Virginia. It was not a decision made lightly or quickly. It had been building for years, she knew, in the particular way that unfinished things build in people who are honest about themselves. The family he had left, the brothers who had gone to a war he had refused, the land his father had owned that was now something different, the debts of various kinds that he had been servicing from a distance for 2 decades. He told her about it one winter evening, not as a proposal requiring her agreement, but as a thing he needed to do that he wanted her to understand. She listened. She asked questions, the practical ones and the emotional ones, in her characteristic order. She said she thought it was the right thing, and that she would be here when he came back, and that she was very interested in what he would find there. He was gone for 6 weeks. He wrote to her from Virginia, 3 letters that took 12 days each way, and the letters were the most revealing things he had ever written her, because the act of writing from that distance dissolved whatever was left of the final layer of reserve, and he told her things about his father and his brothers, and the land and the war, and the people his father had owned, which he went to see, and which he described with the careful moral language of a man who is not excusing anything, but is trying to understand what he is responsible for in the aftermath of something terrible. He paid money to people he could find. He said he could not pay enough and knew it and said so. He came back thinner and quieter and somehow more settled, in the way that people are settled when they have gone back to the place they ran from and found they are no longer afraid of it. She met him at Morrow's Creek when he came off the stage, and she took one look at his face and understood that the thing he had needed to do was done. "How was it?" she asked. "Finished," he said. She took his hand and they walked to the wagon, and she drove home because he looked tired in a way that was deeper than physical, and he sat beside her on the wagon seat and looked at the territory opening around them as they left Morrow's Creek behind, and his face in the afternoon light was the face of a man who has set something down after a very long time of carrying it. "I want to tell you everything," he said. "I know," she said. "We have time." They had time. The territory was around them, enormous and specific and entirely known to them between them, and the homestead was at the end of the track, and the children were there, Elias and Thomas, because Clara was in Caldwell that week, and the spring was beginning to show in the grass, and the sky was the particular blue that comes back every year and surprises you even when you have been watching for it. He told her everything that winter, over many evenings, and she listened with the full attention she had given everything he had offered her since the first map on the first evening, and she held what he told her with the same care she had always held the things he trusted her with. It was not easy, some of it. It was not comfortable, but it was honest, and honesty between them had always been the thing that made everything else possible. They were 45 and 46, David and Henrietta, in the early 1890s, and they were, by any measure available to them, well. The operation was the most productive it had ever been, the land better known and better used with each passing year. Elias was managing the cattle side with increasing autonomy. Thomas had his finger on the commercial side with the effortless social competence that was simply how he was made. Clara was teaching school in Caldwell with a ferocity of commitment that made her students the best prepared young people in the county, and she came home to the homestead for summers and holidays and brought her considerable energy with her in ways that the household always recovered from with pleasure. There was a fourth child. Henrietta had not been entirely certain at 43 that this was the territory they were still in, and then it was, and the child was another girl born in 1890, named Eliza for the cousin in Missouri who cried when she received the letter and wrote back a response 6 pages long. The youngest Eliza was different from all the others, quieter and more watchful, with her mother's particular gift for observation and her father's gray eyes, and she watched the world from a very early age with the expression of someone who is storing everything for a purpose that will reveal itself later. David said, watching small Eliza observe the yard from the porch at age 2, "She's going to know things before anyone tells her." "She already does," Henrietta said. "She gets it from you," he said. "She gets it from the land," Henrietta said. "We all do." He came to stand beside her at the porch rail in the evening light, and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into him for 16 years, with the ease of something that has become the natural configuration of her body in the world. Little Eliza was investigating a beetle on the porch floor with the concentration of a scientist. The evening was warm and the sky above the territory was that irreducible blue, and Consequence, who was very old now but still present, was visible at the fence line with the philosophical patience that had always characterized him. "I've been thinking," David said. "You're always thinking," she said. "What specifically?" "About the map," he said. She waited. She was good at waiting. "I've been thinking about what it meant," he said. "That I came here with the wrong map and you knew it and you said nothing. I've spent a long time thinking I should have been told sooner, that I was foolish not to see it. But I think what I actually believe now, after all of it, is that the wrong map was the thing that brought me here. If I'd had the right map, I might have gone somewhere else." She had thought about this herself, in the 21 months since the walk up the track and the first evening at the kitchen table, with the Hendricks survey spread under the lamp. She had thought about the specific chain of events, the map, the fall spring, the eastern section, the September ride to the limestone shelf, all of it. "The wrong map," she said, "was the best map. For finding where I actually needed to be," he said. "Which was here," she said. "Which was you," he said. She turned to look at him, this man who had been lost and lost again and found better, whose pride she had watched come down like a fence post by fence, post over 2 decades of shared mornings and difficult conversations and children and cattle, and weather and Virginia and legal disputes and apple preserves left on bunkhouse steps. And she saw in his face the full collection of everything they had built together. Not a symbol of it, but the actual substance. The real person she had chosen and who had chosen her, standing in the evening light of the homestead they had made from what her father had started and what both of them had continued and what their children would carry on from. "Here? Yes," she said. "Which was me." He put his arm around her and she put hers around him, and little Eliza abandoned her beetle and came to lean against their legs and look up at them with the watchful gray eyes that missed nothing. And the territory evening settled around them with the enormity and the specific, intimate beauty of a place that has been known and loved long enough to feel entirely and truly like home. Many years later, when people in Morrow's Creek or in Caldwell or in the changed and formalized territory that had been working towards statehood all through this period asked about the Watkins homestead, they said what people say about things that have been done right over a long time, that it was solid, that it had lasted, that the people who built it knew what they were doing. Henrietta Whitaker Watkins, who had known from the first day and said nothing and waited, and David Watkins, who had been too proud to say he was lost until the land and the woman and the accumulated honesty of shared years had made pride into something else entirely, something better and more useful and more true, had built something that deserved that description. They had built a home. From a wrong map, from a first-day silence, from the specific patience of waiting for a man to find where he actually was without taking from him the dignity of finding it himself. They had built a life so complete, and so real, and so full of the ordinary, extraordinary substance of two people choosing each other every day for all the days they had, that the territory itself seemed to acknowledge it the way the territory acknowledged things that were true to its character. Not with ceremony, but with continuance, with the grass coming back every spring, the spring running clear in its limestone shelf, the sky doing its irreducible blue, and the homestead at the end of the track standing solid against everything the years could bring. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.